Hello, this is Socialist Lynx. Today we're going to be talking about the Brazilian Revolution in relation to the national question, as well as many other things as well as hopefully today we're probably going to talk about the practice of racism and capitalism in general, rather than basically looking into the practice of racism during the transformation between feudalism to capitalism, which I think that we can be able to touch in when talking about the Brazilian Revolution. So here we go. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I'd very much appreciate it. And if you like this video, hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate that. And yeah, so just want to let you guys know. I'm gonna probably make more videos about this series and try to basically finish it up. So just to basically let you guys know, that's gonna be basically on my plans as well. And after this series, I'm gonna plan on making a video talking about anarchism and the different foreign anarchist movements and how they actually betrayed workers. As an example of or maybe anarchist figures, not just really anarchist movements, and how they actually betrayed workers. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and yeah, let's get started. When talking about the Brazilian Revolution, we need to keep something in mind about the Brazilian Revolution. We need to keep in mind that basically it was one of the most peaceful formats of basically revolution that actually took place around this time, as well as the fact that this wasn't really a form of revolution from below. It was more of revolution from above, quite literally. And you might think, well, so was the American Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolution. What do you mean? I mean that literally a monarch just wanted independence for their own country as a presidential monarchy versus basically an absolute monarchy or constitutional monarchy within Portugal. Instead, this monarch particularly actually adopted liberal ideas and adopted these ideas to basically be in place among his ideas for liberation, specifically for the merchantry and the peasantry to become bourgeois. So when we talk about the Brazilian Revolution, yeah, I do literally mean that it is a revolution from above, because even during the social relations, the ruling class at the time wanted this revolution to happen, specifically of the ruling class in Brazil. All this started actually when basically the Brazilian monarchy ended up leaving Portugal as a way to basically escape Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Portugal, of the entire Iberian Peninsula. And while doing this, Portugal ended up being abandoned by the landlordry during the Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion within the Iberian Peninsula. Add this with the many other efforts to basically be able to like modernize Brazil and be able to have the Brazilian holding of the Empire of Portugal to be able to the Portuguese Empire to be able to have a closer relation to the Brazilian peasantry and the Brazilian enslaved within the region. This is basically a way where they can benefit, and they can justify their holding and their ruling a lot further. All of this started when John Bragança the Sixth of Portugal ended up actually leaving the country and taking all of his the rest of basically what could be left of the ruling class in Portugal at the time, being the landlordry, as well as the fact other state aristocrats and also autocrats to be able to like govern the state of Portugal into basically the state of into the state of Brazil, which was a holding of the Portuguese Empire. Not long after, during their stay, after it became known that Napoleon Bonaparte's holding over the Iberian Peninsula would stay, John Bragança the Sixth decided to basically make the capital of Portugal and the rest of the Portuguese Empire to be the capital to be in Rio de Janeiro, which was basically a very backward which is basically a very backward city at the time. That after basically being able to make it a capital, they try to basically model it after Lisbon, which was the original capital of the Portuguese Empire. Thanks to this effort, Portugal was able to modernize, and they're able to actually get a full peasantry involved, and they were even able to basically get a little bit more machinery involved as well, which allowed Portugal, compared to other Latin American states, to be able to compared to other Latin American states to be able to have a little bit more holding, have a little bit more say, economically speaking, to the rest of the region. To this day, Brazil, with Venezuela and Colombia, still leads the region economically into South America. However, this does not mean that the landlordry was justified into colonizing Brazil. In fact, the exact opposite. Even especially when they end up occupying the land of Brazil. Before and after the occupation of Brazil from the actual royal family, many peasants would face terrible conditions to having to basically pay for their surplus taxes and to even the king himself, just so that way they could stay on the land and not be homeless. Some taxes were so high that peasants end up having to actually destroy their houses in order to basically have more land to plot food, in order to basically have more land to basically plot produce in, and then pay that to their landlord and barely make it. Some were not even able to do that, and some were even not able to do that and and ended up becoming homeless in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And this is not even talking about the enslaved. The enslaved, like in Haiti, had actually a large population and was easily susceptible to death, disease, and many other problems that was facing Haiti at the time. Out of the 60%, if we understand that in the transatlantic slave trade, Haiti's slave population ended up making 60% of the transatlantic slave trade. Guess where 30% made up of the transatlantic slave trade? That's right, Brazil. Brazil ended up making around 30% of the transatlantic slave trade, and they had a large enslaved population because of it. And they're able to destroy and entirely coerce basically slaves kidnapped from Africa in order to consider them as property and sell them into slave markets around the time as a form of basically cheap labor for the landlordry, as well as the fact just be able to have them build cities like Rio de Janeiro and other cities and towns around the region of Brazil. However, it was under the royal holdings and under the occupation of the royal family did slavery and the enslaved actually increase production as well. When the royal family came to Brazil, they specifically used slaves as a way to modernize the Rio de Janeiro and make it more like the Ciudad de Lisbon. Ciudad de Lisbon, entirely, which was in Portugal at the time, but then was occupied by the French under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. So to basically understand Brazil, like Haiti and America, they were also still using slavery, despite the fact that they were trying to basically bring feudalism. That was a way to basically have feudalism with a slave law and remain. And it was especially profitable for the landlordry to use this system as a way to basically build up their more cities when they were traveling, like the royal family of Portugal, but also as a way to be able to basically outcompete other landlord states around the time, to be able to basically outcompete them economically speaking, without necessarily conquest, but rather just having more surplus production, having more wealth concentrated to the landlordry, rather than basically just having rather than just basically being able to, instate feudalism in its full state within colonized nations as a way to basically be able to increase more surplus production. One thing further, another thing to understand on what would lead to the actual successes of the Brazilian Revolution was the fact that basically the entire, Brazilian royal family was actually out against each other. Not just only John Barazaga the Sixth was actually at heads with basically Napoleon Bonaparte. John Barazaga the Sixth was actually ended up at heads with his own wife that he was married to at the age of 17 and her at the age of 10. Jesus Christ, feudalism really fucking sucked back then. Oh my god. Imagine getting married at the age of fucking 10. Jesus Christ. There, he was married to Catherine Juanica, of Castile, in Spain. Not only did he not like her, but he actually thought that she was a political agent for the Spanish kingdom. And she thought that not only was the Portuguese Empire so backward because they would not even let a woman, even a noble woman, to be able to speak in political affairs, but she also thought that basically her husband was a dumb, foolish idiot that looked like a, what was this shit said that she looked like again? A mashed up potato salad. That's her own words. Okay. Wow. Specifically, a mashed up potato salad with eyes and a mouth. And a nose. Okay. So that's her own words, by the way. Alright. Oh, another thing, she was actually a political agent for the Spanish kingdom. That's another thing that we need to consider here. In fact, this will actually become very important later onto why Brazil was able to become independent in the first place. Fast forward a bit of time, Napoleon Bonaparte ended up actually leaving the Iberian Peninsula, and it was granted kingdoms of Spain and also Portugal its own independence as well. Plus, not to mention, the French ended up actually being defeated in Napoleonic Wars, with Napoleon Bonaparte actually having to basically leave France into an island in the middle of nowhere, in the around the Atlantic Ocean, that was occupied by guards to make sure he wouldn't escape, in order to basically go for France, to be able to conquer basically other parts of Europe. But John Barazaga the Sixth ended up actually having faced actually a dilemma around this time. You see, he actually already had built up quite a lot of work and also built up quite a lot of efforts to be able to build up Brazil to that of the same level of the city of Lisbon. Not to mention, he ended up using a lot of his resources to be able to gain support within the Brazilian peasantry and the enslaved. Because of the very first time, the Brazilian peasantry and the enslaved were not merely just, pawns for basically a colonial policy and were just there in order to basically act as servants for the king. Now the king was actually there, and he actually started meeting with the peasantry and the enslaved, which actually corresponded with a increasing tension for false consciousness between the peasantry and the enslaved to the king, John Barazaga the Sixth. So because of this, he had to basically find a replacement, and no better replacement than his own son Pedro Barazaga the First. But here's the thing about Pedro Barazaga. Pedro Barazaga didn't really like monarchy, nor did he actually want to become a monarchist. He favored liberal ideas and an idea of a presidential republic, a constitutional republic, like that of the United States, and also the first French Republic within France, as well as the Republic of Haiti, where there would be separation of powers, as well as the fact an idea of basically limits of powers to the executive branch, with other branches of state being able to basically govern other sectors of state, such as law, legislation, policy, etc., and not have all of that things basically be declared or be controlled by the leader of the nation. However, the leader of the nation would still be able to command officers, and be able to still command other things among as a commander in chief among an army, as well as the fact that the president can still propose policy and can still propose action that would have to be passed by a Congress or a Senate as a legislative branch within the state. Then it would be up to a judicial branch to actually interpret those legislation, interpret those laws, in order to basically accurately estimate on how these things would basically be put into practice, quote unquote. In other words, he favored instead of really a monarchy to basically benefit the landlordry, with the king being a landlord himself, able to appoint other landlords at his disposal to be able to justify their landlord state. He thought that basically there should be a system in which commodities can exchange furtherly, and that state should act in the interest of the bourgeoisie through in other words, the owners of private property and the people that could buy labor power in the first place, as a way to be able to spread its influence and spread basically its wealth quite a lot further, and as well as accumulate more capital by accumulating more labor. In this factor, they also basically wanted that state to then be made up of representatives and also bureaucrats that are in the interest of the bourgeoisie, to be able to act among them, but not act so furtherly to the point where they can harm against the bourgeoisie as well, just in case someone from the people is indeed elected to be able to actually make policy to increase social welfare that would end up actually competing the profits, and actually competing with profits, and also competing with other things that the bourgeoisie might need entirely, rather than having a direct democracy or any democracy at all instead. Basically, Pedro Barzaga the First, instead of he didn't really want an autocracy, he wanted to replace an autocracy with a bureaucracy. So that ended up facing a big problem between Pedro Barzaga and John Barzaga, his own father. However, it was to be done anyways. On the year of 1820, Pedro Barzaga was declared to be the king and the holder and governor of Brazil. Not to mention as well, but the current empire and its holding would not necessarily just be now then the Portuguese Empire. It would be the Empire of Portugal and Brazil, which meant that not only did Brazil was now considered as its own independent nation in a federal empire with Portugal, but that also meant that basically Pedro Barzaga I wasn't merely just the king of Portugal, wasn't just the future king of Portugal that essentially governed over Brazil. He was actually now the king of Brazil, and he himself could actually make legislation, as well as the fact try to make a government to be independent of Portugal, to be able to actually enact his liberal ideas in the first place. After reading into various authors such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jean Locke, Thomas Paine, John Adams, Jean-Paul Marat, and many other liberals at the time, he thought that basically liberalism would actually be very much a good idea, and would be used into a very good way against basically their enemies. Not to mention, but Pedro Barzaga ended up marrying to the Duchess of the Habsburgs, which was a noble family, and is holding into regions such as Prussia, España, and the Netherlands around the time. That ended up actually adopting also some liberal ideas that Pedro Barzaga also had. With enough support from the peasantry and the enslaved, but after recruiting them into basically a standing army controlled by Pedro Barzaga, and declarations for a new kind of state independent from Portugal completely, Pedro Barzaga ended up declaring war and declaring independence of Brazil against the Empire of Portugal. 2 years of fighting would increase, including an attempted invasion from Portugal into Rio de Janeiro around that time that ended up failing, as well as the fact an invasion of the northern coastal region of Brazil that also ended up failing as well, with armies being able to basically take Brazil, with armies being able to defend Brazil in a very effective way. Because the army itself was made up of peasants and the enslaved that actually thought that they would actually get some form of liberty, and not just get some form of liberty, but not have that liberty be quote unquote crushed, but not have that quote unquote liberty be crushed by a bureaucracy that's only made as a way to basically benefit a small minority of basically a private property owning class. Instead, they thought that everyone be considered as an equal participant within politics, and they would be able to not just that, but also some slaves actually thought they would be able to be liberated after the war. But also, they thought that they would be able to have the right to vote, as well as the fact being able to abolish private property entirely and be able to abolish classes in order to basically have a real democratic society. This did not happen, however. It was soon after the war and was soon after the revolution itself, when slaves and peasants when slaves were basically right back down to basically where they were as owned private property themselves. However, after the revolution did take place in the end in 1824, where the Empire of Brazil was founded, the peasantry was indeed emancipated from serfdom, and they were allowed to be able to buy their own private property, to be able to produce their own commodities. But that would necessarily not happen because other people were then buying out other properties of peasants. And look no further to basically merchants around the time that were able to accumulate enough wealth to be able to basically buy up that private property. And then basically employ workers to work on that private property in order to basically accumulate capital and facilitate capital in the first place. And then sell what they produce in order to basically sell what basically the workers produce after facilitating capital as commodities, and then sell those commodities into the market as a way to then not only then basically accumulate labor, which facilitate capital, but then would be able to accumulate capital, which would then facilitate profit. Because of this, many peasants ended up actually having to basically sell their labor power to other people, specifically people that were basically buying up labor power in the first place, in order to be able to sustain themselves. So basically, overnight, just like in the rest of Europe and actually other countries, capitalism was instated within Brazil after the revolution took place. And just like other countries, such as the United States of America, Brazil ended up being one of the bourgeois states that still allowed slavery within its economic system, therefore creating capitalism with a slave law and remain. Unlike America, however, Brazil would still keep slavery all the way up until 1883, when finally the state actually declared the Emancipation Proclamation for their own country, where slavery would be abolished. Unlike in America, where a second American Revolution had to take place in order for basically slavery to actually be abolished entirely. Which leads off to basically the second point and actually a fourth chapter of this series, when we're talking about the practice of racism within capitalism. Capitalism specifically is an economic system that focuses on commodity production and the exchange of those commodities via the basically exchanging those commodities in the market, where the market acts as a system in which commodities can exchange in the first place. And commodity production is basically the production for products produced for exchange value. When referring to capitalism this way, this is able to not only then analyze basically the core production process of capitalism and how it's able to create class struggle in the first place, where there are going to be workers that are necessary in order to basically produce those commodities in a certain amount of labor time, and the value of that commodity being represented into the surplus value that is produced for it to basically produce one single commodity entirely. But it's also going to necessarily affect basically the actions and the actual formats of basically how this economic system is able to even take place in the first place. The reason why it's necessary to be able to basically analyze these things is because it's already been answered. If we talk about business society based off commodity production, which is a product produced for exchange value, and therefore, in order for those products to actually be used and to actually, be able to be consumed, there needs to be exchange for those commodities, and therefore it needs to create a medium of circulation, a medium of exchange for those commodities to be able to be exchanged in the first place. That entirely means that basically humans, by contrast to basically other economic systems previously to capitalism, would have more social relationships with literal physical products and also money itself than actual human beings. This essentially becomes a fetishism of commodities and commodity production. And like other economic systems before capitalism and even after, if we do get to socialism and communism, which hopefully we will, and yeah, it seems like we will if we be able to actually do our efforts to build up the working class and their spontaneous action in a period of revolutionary epoch. This does not necessarily mean that basically then. This then basically means that this system, right, is able to go side internationally and is able to have an international world market in which these commodities are able to exchange in the first place in order to basically reach other countries that don't even practice capitalism, but essentially would essentially be coerced through imperialism or through coerced action and militarism to be able to become imperialist and to be able to become capitalist in the first place, such as the Opium Wars between Britain and China, as well as the fact the American occupation, the American military involvement within Japan that made Japan open its borders for international exchange. Because of this, domination involves the exploitation of free wage labor, benefit enormously to a critical phase in development of imperialism, and specifically into things like slavery and also other formats of basically accumulating capital. This relationship continued into the era of the Industrial Revolution. The textile factories of whose heartland in northern England imported the main raw material of this from slave plantations of the American South. Capitalism's reliance on slave labor became an anomaly requiring explanation, and a respected, increasingly acknowledged on the rights of human beings, and began to take hold. And the ideas of basically the right for human beings versus the right for other people to be able to make profit out of the depravity of other people's rights started to come into question. And many bourgeois businessmen actually then started actually justifying slavery as in the South as a way to be able to basically accumulate more profit and accumulate more capital entirely. This is the historical relation between capitalism to racism in general. Racism thus gives white workers gives particularly white people and even white workers a particular identity, and one moreover which unites them with white capitalists. We have here the cast of the kind of imaginary community discussed by Benedict Anderson and Alex Kalinikos, and various influential analysis of nationalism. The nation has argued an imagined political community, in particular, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each. The nation always is conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship, and in this case, this could also basically coincide with the comradeship of race and also racial hierarchy. The fact of the matter is that nationalism thinks in terms of the historical destinies, while racism dreams of the eternal containments transmitted from the origins of time through the endless sequence of loathsome capitulations outside history. But it is something that has happened due to the fact of class struggle and class nature entirely, which has been able to enhance further and able to increase into a more damaging degree under capitalism compared to other forms of racism previously. Therefore, racism itself is something that has happened and something that is specific to class societies, but is also something that is specific to each given class society that can actually basically coincide and actually be able to facilitate itself in many other class societies, to the point where the specific functions of how racism comes about is specific. But the fact of racism and how it operates in general, and the actual patterns between racism and class society and class struggle is absolute, is an absolute thing that coincides with class struggle and class societies in general, and not just a specific class society. This can coincide with basically nation states and taking over those nation states and creating some form of hierarchical, mythical hierarchical complex that is able to suggest that basically one group of people is more allocate and is better than others. This is specific to basically other forms of basically economic systems and economic relations and stages within capitalism that's able to facilitate itself. Namely, imperialism. Imperialism is capitalism based off finance capital. Capitalism itself seeks to dominate over other nations to grow the proletariat as a large function. When they invade and dominate over other nations, and they integrate a national people to be a part of the proletariat, a part of the same bourgeois class that buys the layer power of workers in other nations as well. With the rise of imperialism gives the rise with the resentment of imperialism and the interest of the bourgeoisie using imperialism to be being made for more commodities to be made and to have a higher expression of value, which entails more workers that are in these nations they take over. As well as the fact even have banks within the national bourgeois state where the bourgeoisie comes from to be able to basically finance the capital as being facilitated within this imperialized nation, and then basically exporting that capital outside that nation entirely in order to have that higher expression of value in the first place. An example would basically be the British takeover of India, where they were able to take over India and basically usurp basically a lot of the industry that was being built there, as well as basically facilitate their own capital that British banks could be able to invest in to create finance capital within the regions of India, where the Mughal Empire used to reside in before the British took over through the East India Company under capitalism after years of basically trying to colonize it without much success under feudalism. Through this effort, this is able to actually create the first times and the first instances of basically imperialism in the very early stages of capitalism itself. Another example is the French colonization and the French imperialism within Northern Africa and Indochina, where they're able to basically take over those lands and also do the same thing as what Britain was doing within India and other bourgeois states around the time, where they're able to basically take over those nations, build up industry and build up workplaces, and then have their banks in their own nations be able to finance basically the capital that's being facilitated in those nations, and then export that capital to basically other countries around the world to be able to have a higher expression of value and also create a larger working class base, not just in France but also around the world. This is the specific function of imperialism, where it is capitalism based off finance capital. Because of the fact that basically this finance capital is facilitated by banks within the imperialist nations to then finance that capital within the imperialized nations, which screws over the people in those regions entirely. Another example is the institution of capitalism with a slave law and remain within the United States of America that was in place until there could be another revolution made by workers. However, in relation under the leadership of a bourgeois state, to be able to abolish that form of slavery in the first place and abolish capitalism with a slave law and remain. Because one thing needs to be understood about slavery and capitalism. Slavery and capitalism go hand in hand because slaves are the cheapest labor possible that's able to basically produce commodities and thus act as workers that are somehow independent, that are able to live by themselves as people, which at the same time be able to act as private property themselves to work on private property for a certain amount of labor time into the workday, producing commodities, thus be able to facilitate abstract surplus value and which they are not able to get paid for, both the surplus value that they produce and also the price of labor power that both go to the slave or bourgeois in an abstract form that's not actually able to basically pay the enslaved in the first place, because they are considered as private property, basically working as well under private property as well, producing commodities. To talk about basically imperialism within India that I was talking about earlier, I want to be able to basically quote Karl Marx and his analysis of basically British landlords that basically turned bourgeois into basically their imperialist actions within India. So without further ado, begin. Quote, admitting, however, the lands of India are private property held as a good and strong private title as land elsewhere, who shall be regarded as the real owners? There are two parties from whom this claim had been set up. One of these parties is the class known as the Zemindars and the Talukdars, who have been considered to occupy a position in the similar to the landed nobility and the gentry to Europe. The gentry of Europe, to be indeed the real owners of the land and subject a certain assessment due to the government as owners, to have the right of displacing and at pleasure the actual cultivators, who is in view in the case regard in the standing and the position of the more tenants liable to any payment in the way of rent of the zemindars may see fit to impose. The view of the case is which naturally fell into the English ideas, is important and necessary to the landed gentry, the main pillar of social fabric, and was made the foundation of the famous landed settlement of Bengal 70 years ago, under the governor generalship of Lord Cornwallis. A settlement which still remains in force, but which maintained by many great injustice of the government and the actual cultivators. A more thorough study of the institutions of Hindustan, together of the inconveniences, both social and political, resulting from the Bengal settlement, has been given currency to the opinion of the original Hindu institutions. The property land was in the village corporations, in which resided the power of allocating the out to individuals for cultivation, while the zemindars and talukdars were in origin nothing but officers in government appointed to look after, to collect and pay over the prince of the assessment due from the village. This view has influenced a considerable degree of the settlement of the landed tenures of the revenue made of last years in the Indian provinces, of which the direct administration has been assumed by the English. The exclusive proprietary rights claimed that the Talukdars and the Zemindars have been regarded as the originating usurpations of once against the government and cultivators' effort to have been get rid of them, and the incubus on the real cultivators of the soil, the general improvement of the country. As well, however, these middlemen, whatever the origin of the right to be, could claim of the prescription in their favor, it was impossible to recognize claims of a certain extent legal, however inconvenient, arbitrary, and oppressive to the people. In Oud, under the feeble reign of the native princes, these feudal landholders have gone very far in curdling alike the claims of the government and the rights of the cultivators, when upon the recent annexation of the kingdom, this matter came under revision. The commissioners charged with the making of the settlements soon got into a very acrimonious controversy with them of the real extent of their rights. Hence resulted a state of discontent on their part, which led them to the common cause with revolted sepoys. End quote. Karl Marx. Lord Canning's Proclamation and Land Tenure in India. Many forms of racism still coincides today with the overall, also overall struggles of basically black people within the United States, and also around the world, where black communities are essentially more policed and are a lot more susceptible to being killed and also being harmed by police officers, as well as white people in general, within their neighborhoods, and actually really being safe within their own neighborhoods as well, being faced with very large amounts of of violence and despotism within their areas, as well as the fact on facing with economic immobility compared to other white people around the world as well. This is able to create an advantage specifically for white workers to be able to actually have more of a effort to against basically have more of an effort really against basically workers and marginalized groups than actually being able to address and to actually furtherly understand the current class struggles and the current efforts of basically the working class in totality, by basically forcing them, but also being able to coerce them into becoming very low paid workers that are desperate in order to basically get paid money in order to basically get out of the economic condition, which is hard in of itself in the first place, because most black people and Latino people in general, or Latine people, sorry, I'm gonna use gender neutral, Latine people are less likely to actually be employed into jobs compared to white people, statistically speaking. Another example is the fact that basically a lot of marginalized people end up actually having to basically do a lot of hardworking jobs and a lot of hard labor jobs around the world today, compared to other groups of people that are not really marginalized, such as white people. White people make up majority of the service work industry, which in of itself is indeed hard to do, but is not as hard as like metal workers or factory workers today, where most of them are usually made up of either indigenous people, black people, or Latinos around the world, and basically make up that huge majority of basically workforce today, which does indeed show that basically there is indeed a line and advantages that basically certain people based off like a white background can indeed have advantages compared to others. This doesn't necessarily coincide to privilege, however, and in fact is one of my criticisms with privilege theory, is the fact that basically it creates an example that somehow this privilege or this advantage that really people have is basically it basically idolizes the idea that basically white people basically have a ruling position within society. In reality, they really don't. In fact, they usually make up a advantage against others, basically under capitalism, rather than really being able to actually have much really power positions at all. Rather, they just have certain economic advantages, have certain economic mobility, power compared to marginalized people around the world that basically do not really have those same exact advantages. Because of that, it creates an unfair playing field, as well as the fact it creates a certain dynamic and it creates a certain idea that basically by trying to be able to have this advantages and calling it a privilege, right, not only entails that racism in itself, to not go through racism is a privilege rather than a right to not go through racism, but also it entails that basically these people actually have certain power, that actually have power positions when they really don't. They just have certain advantages compared to others, and that's the reality of basically what these people really face. And it is true that basically there is economic inequality even among the working class based off marginalized lines, and also due to racist actions and racist laws that have been passed for years and years and years that are still in effect today, such as the Jim Crow legislation, but also anti-Irish and anti-Indian laws passed in Britain that economically disparaged and impoverished Bengali, Bangladesh, Indian, and Pakistani communities within Britain, but also not just basically marginalized groups of non-white backgrounds, but even marginalized groups of white backgrounds, such as the Irish people within the United Kingdom of Britain, where they were indeed impoverished because of also racist laws that were passed against them. Although not to the same degree nor to the same magnitude as compared to policies that were passed against Bengali, Bangladesh, Indian, and Pakistani communities within the United Kingdom of Britain, but also just in general in Europe, as well as Muslims and also Arabs today within Europe that also face huge amounts of discrimination against from European nations, such even including into Scandinavian nations such as Norway and Denmark. This has been a factor within capitalism for a very long time, and is specifically a factor that basically allows huge amounts of economic disparity and economic impoverishment for marginalized communities compared to other white workers. But also, it is a way to basically for the bourgeoisie to basically pin and use marginalized communities as scapegoats against basically times and during times of basically crisis and war for basically economic failures, rather than having workers understand it is the total mode of production of capitalism itself that leads to basically that leads to these things actually being able to happen in the first place. An example is actually a very recent example where during 2008, many bourgeois business owners end up actually blaming social welfare checks to be passed that have been basically being have actually being able to be given to black people within the United States of America as the reason why basically the 2008 market crash ended up happening, because of the idea that basically you're giving too much money to people that don't really earn it, that are basically criminals, quote unquote, that are not working hard and are bringing drugs into the country, yada yada yada. And also basically, and also blaming the 2008 crisis as well on Latina people, on Latina workers that have been quote unquote stealing jobs from white people and that are like secretly taking over the nation, basically creating this creating this anti-black and anti-Latina narrative of racism and xenophobia, basically against these communities, that essentially led to more violence against these communities as a scapegoat against basically these communities, rather than actually addressing the real realities of the mode of production, that capitalism itself is basically the reason why economic crises like these happen, because of the anarchic and the actual chaotic functions of the market, and especially the world market under capitalism. To talk about the historical narratives of racism within capitalism, it's best to quote Karl Marx on this factor of even talking about the slave trade and how slavery goes hand in hand within capitalism. Quote, "As to the question of the slave trade itself, Spain was denounced by the Bishop of Oxford, as well as Lord Brougham, as the main state for the nefarious traffic, both of them, upon the British government to force by every means in its power that country into the course of the policy of the consonant of the existing treaties. As early as 1840, the general treaty was entered between the Great Britain and Spain, in which the latter is the unequivocal condemnation of the slave trade. In 1817, a specific treaty was concluded by which Spain fixed an abolition of the slave trade on part of her own subjects for the year 1820, and by the compensation of those losses of their subjects might suffer under the carrying a contract received indemnity of £400,000. The money was pocketed, but no equivalent tendered for it. In 1835, a new treaty was entered by which Spain bound herself and to formally bring sufficiently string a penal law to make it impossible for her subjects to continue the traffic. The procrastinating Spanish proverb, a la mañana, was again strictly adhered to. It was only 10 years later that the penal law was carried, and to the singular mischance of the principal clause contended for England was left out, namely the fact of making the slave trade piracy. In one word, nothing was done to save the Captain General of Cuba and the minister at home. The camarilla if rumor speaks true of the royal personages themselves, raised a prior tax upon the slavers, selling a license of dealing in human flesh and blood at so many doubloons per hand. End quote. Karl Marx, The British Government and the Slave Trade. In other words, what Marx is basically saying here is that despite the fact that there were laws against slavery around this time, the British government and Spain itself as well, and even France, ended up actually still using slave labor within imperialized nations, or was specifically getting commodities from slave held nations. Such as an example was the United States of America, where slavery was still in place, and Britain was getting cotton and also sugar and coffee from slave plantations that was built within the United States of America. Same with Britain getting slave plantations and getting produced cotton and sugar and coffee and tobacco grown from slave plantations owned by Spain within Cuba. So because of this, basically, slavery wasn't actually really abolished, despite the fact that there were laws against slavery, even passed by Spain all the way early from 1814. However, slavery in Cuba still continued all the way up until 1865. And there was even still an underground slave trade that was still existing within Cuba even later. To the point where basically slavery, as at least official system, would probably be later abolished around 1875 within Cuba. And within the United States of America, there had to be an entire second American Revolution for that to even take place, for there to actually be the abolition of slavery entirely. And yes, I do mean the second American Revolution, because there was indeed a second American Revolution. It talks about basically that kind of form of basically resistance entirely around that. To talk about the certain advantages as well, the forms of false consciousness that basically workers can face under capitalism, it is best to quote Alex Kalinikos on this factor. Quote, racism thus gives white workers a particular identity, one moreover which unites them with white capitalists. We have here then a case of the kind of imagined community discussed by Benedict Anderson in his influential analysis of nationalism. The nation, he argues, as an imagined political community in particular, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each nation, has always conceived a deep horizontal comradeship. Anderson, however, stresses that he has differences between nationalism, he sees differences between nationalism and racism. The fact of the matter, he writes, is that nationalism thinks in terms of historical destinies, while racism dreams of eternal contaminations transmitted from the origins of time through an endless sequence of loathsome copulations outside history. It is undoubtedly true that as we have seen, racist ideology conceives race, or more recently ethnicity, as an inescapable fate. Nevertheless, Anderson's argument fails to take into account the way in which recent decades and the idea of national culture has become one of the main reasons to use to justify, for example, tightening up immigration controls. Consider Thatcher's infamous appeal to those afraid of being swamped by people with a different culture discussed above. End quote. Alex Klinikos, Race and Class. this same practice as Thatcher's way of basically dealing with immigration, tightening up immigration entirely, is the exact same policies that many conservative politicians around the world, especially here in the United States, tries to basically do against immigrants and marginalized communities within the United States as well, specifically Latina people coming into the United States. And not necessarily even white immigrants basically coming into the United States, but rather specifically Latina people, because these people are part of like a different race and part of different ethnicity, right? That have a different cultural barrier and have a different cultural identity compared to majority of the American population, specifically majority of the white American population that still uses and still like functions under German and Anglo-Saxon forms of basically cultural identity, while the Mexicano the Pueblo Mexicanos, they don't really go by that. They really go by more different ethnicities and more different cultural identities, which essentially coincides with basically uses of basically discriminatory actions and also forms of basically actions against them because of basically the idea that basically these because of using them as a scapegoat and using these ideas as scapegoats to basically spread false consciousness among the working class, but also as a way to be able to control basically more populations, control the labor market even further to the benefit of the bourgeoisie to be able to buy labor power in the first place. Specifically to make workers basically lower their wages and lower the price of their labor power, so that way they're willing to basically sell that labor power at a cheaper cost for them to basically buy up the labor power for them to work on the private property in the first place. So that way they can have more control into that labor market. As best stated by Alex Klinikos in the same work that I quoted before, quote, racism then helps to keep capitalism going. It is thus the interest of the capitalist class. But what about the working class? Perhaps the more important differences between Marxists and black nationalists is that the latter believes the white workers materially benefit from racism. The other side of the belief tends to the idea of the black movement, which transcends class divisions. This is theorized in various ways. Cedric Robertson argues the agency of revolutionary change is not the industrial working class, but the black radical tradition articulating the black collective identity forged by centuries of resistance. End quote. Alex Klinikos, Race and Class. What Alex Klinikos here is saying, though, is not to say that basically black nationalism and basically a form of basically black resistance against capitalism is something that's inherently not revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. What it's saying, though, is that basically these movements for black liberation and black nationalism itself is able to actually be able to coincide with the international class struggle of the working class, in comparison and in contrast to what some black nationalists like Angela Davis and also the Nation of Islam basically in the United States basically would like to believe. Instead, basically, these forms of black nationalism and forms of black nationalism that coincides with international class struggles, such as Huey P. Newton, Fred Hampton, C.L.R. James, and George Padmore, that believed in black national liberation and for a creation of a new African Republic, they believe that basically that form of way and that form of basically struggle also coincide with with white people being able to help them as well, but independently in their own movements as well, with an international solidarity between them compared to basically other movements as well around the world that could basically usurp them, but also use as a way to basically to be able to take control and take action for their own self-emancipation for themselves as black people against white supremacy under capitalism. Regardless, as we can see, there is still indeed various problems and various functions that basically happen to these communities that essentially marginalize and destroy a lot of these like communities entirely, which basically makes them entirely face huge amounts of discrimination, huge amounts of problems within their areas. And this is one of the major problems that like essentially goes on to these communities today, and which is something I want to basically touch on when talking about the resistance to that form of racism under capitalism. The first, of course, very powerful resistance against racism was, well, the Haitian Revolution that I mentioned earlier, where basically black people themselves were rebelling against basically white supremacy and racist actions entirely. That was basically the first forms of basically racism, as best explained by C.L.R. James in his work The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the San Domingo Revolution. But another form of resistance against racism was the American Civil War, or the Second American Revolution, where black people and specifically the black working class rebelled against the bourgeoisie, and specifically the slaver bourgeoisie, against basically people that were trying to make them become slaves and make them produce commodities entirely, which is something that was against basically their interests, and therefore they rebelled against the Confederacy and instituted basically their own legislation and their own pressure against the United States government, against the United States bourgeois state, to be able to force them to be able to make the emancipation of slavery be a real thing within the United States of America. This is best stated by Karl Marx himself, where he talks about basically the importance of basically the enslaved, and how they actually were able to commit self-power and self-emancipation into a certain degree, despite the fact that the revolution itself was led by a bourgeois state with basically bureaucratic distortions in the revolution itself. Quote, at the border states, the disputed areas in which the two systems have hitherto contended for domination are a thorn in the flesh of the South. There can, on the other hand, be no mistake that in the course of the war up to now, they have constituted the chief weakness of the North. One section of the slaveholders in these districts simulated loyalty to the North and bidding of the conspirators in the South. Another section found that, in fact, the accordance to the real interests of the traditional ideas to go with the Union. Both sections have equally crippled the North. Anxiety to keep the loyal slaveholders of the border states in good humor. Fear of throwing them into arms of secession, in a word. Tender regard for the interests and the prejudices and the sensibilities of the ambiguous allies have smitten the Union government into incurable weaknesses. In the beginning of the war, driven from the half measures, forced into dissemble away the principle of the war and to spare the foe's most vulnerable spot and the root of evil slavery itself. When only recently Lincoln's pronouncedly revoked Fremont's Missouri Proclamation on the emancipation of Negroes belonging to the rebels. This was done solely on regard to the loud protests of loyal slaveholders of Kentucky. However, a turning point was already reached. With Kentucky, the last border state, has been pushed into the series of battlefields between South and North, with the real war for the border states and the border states themselves. The question of winning or losing them is withdrawn in the spirit of diplomatic and parliamentary discussions. One section of slaveholders will throw off the mask of loyalty, and the other will contest of the prospect of financial compensation such as Great Britain gave the West Indian planters. Events themselves drive of the proclamation a decisive slogan, emancipation of the slaves. End quote, Karl Marx, The Civil War in the United States. One of the major functions of basically the United States was its specific adherence to basically racism, despite the abolition of slavery. And this quote by Huey P. Newton, I think, demonstrates that. Quote, the black people in America are only people who can free the world, loosen the yoke of colonialism, and destroy the war machine. As long as the wheels of imperialistic war machine are turning, there is no country that can defeat the monster of the West. But black people can make a malfunction of this machine from within. Black people can destroy the machinery that's enslaving the world. America cannot stand in every black country in the world and fight a civil war at the same time. It is militarily impossible to do both these things at once. The slavery of blacks in this country provides the oil for the machinery of war that America uses to enslave the peoples of the world. Without this oil, the machinery cannot function. We are the driving shaft of such strategic position in this machinery that once we become dislocated, the functioning of the remainder of the machinery breaks down. Penned up in the ghettos of America, surrounded by his factories and the physical components of his economic system, we have been made into the wretched of the earth, who are relegated into the position of spectators, while the white racists run their international con game on the suffering of peoples. We have been brainwashed to believe that we are powerless and that there is nothing we can do for ourselves to bring about a speedy liberation for our people. We have been taught that we must please our oppressors, that we are only 10% of the population and therefore must confine our tactics in categories calculated not to disturb the sheep of our tormentors. End quote. Huey P. Newton, in defense of self-defense. This quote from Huey P. Newton represents basically the amounts of basically resistance that would later go on within the United States, but also around the world against imperialism in general by marginalized communities such as Indians, Bangladesh people, and also Irish people against basically different forms of basically oppression that are basically being faced, as well as the Vietnamese national liberation movements that were going on around the time. This form of basically national liberation and this form of basically resisting into these forms of oppression is something that essentially indirectly attacks the formats of capitalism itself, because these forms of basically resistances is able to allow an entire group of people and marginalized people that have been oppressed for years and centuries to be able to finally rebel against the formats that have been attacking them and that have been essentially marginalizing them to the point where they have essentially been facing huge amounts of discriminatory actions that face their entire communities. Because of this factor, this is the reality of basically the kinds of formats that basically these people had to go through, as well as the fact that this is basically the formats on basically what people need to understand on basically resistance against racism and how that coincides right to the overall struggle against capitalism itself. Because racism, especially in the formats of capitalism, has been able to be enhanced under capitalism, and this is a way where basically people have been able to resist against that and is able to basically go against that into various ways. Another example of resistance against racism is actually the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, where Palestinian people are fighting against the Israeli fascist state that have been oppressing them for years and years, and have been specifically imperializing their land for their own fascistic takeover of basically the land of Palestine into an idea of basically Zionist ideology against the people of Palestine entirely. That was specifically done after the fact that basically there's an economic crisis in Palestine in 1948, where Britain allowed the Zionist Party of Palestine to be able to take power within Palestine and create the state of Israel. An idea that basically there is a Jewish nation for the Jews and that for the Jews themselves, despite the fact that there's already a minority group living within the lands of Palestine that they claim to be Israel. And these group of people within the areas of Palestine are the Palestinians. There has been many mass movements and many forms of resistance, from basically mass movements and mass demonstrations and spontaneous struggle to just straight up guerrilla warfare and also terrorism being committed by many Palestinian National Liberation Movement organizations. Of course, some of these efforts are indeed ineffective and have actually resulted into more harm against the Palestinian communities within the areas of Palestine that are being imperialized and are being torn apart by a fascist government within their area. However, this is something that regardless of these things, is something that we should be able to support, because this is something that is made by workers themselves, and workers that are specifically facing against the forms of oppression and the forms of basically problems that basically are facing around their nation, which is something that the internationalist communist tendency does not understand, especially when understanding the different forms of advantages that Israeli working class people have compared to basically the Palestinian working class, which results into very different struggles and into very different abilities in which basically these workers can actually rebel, as well as the fact even the different forms of basically uneven economic and political development of the class and political consciousness of the working class to actually even be able to rebel in the first place, which comes to us to be able to spread that class and political consciousness for them to even resist in the first place as well. And what I mean by resist, I mean for them to resist effectively. Because, of course, there always has been resistance against Israel from the Palestinian working class, especially ever since the establishment of the Israeli state. And there still continues to be so. And the efforts to basically rebel against that is something that has to be effectively done through an international vanguard party to be able to do that. But that's getting into but we'll get into that specific format later. Another form of resistance against racism under capitalism was the Irish Revolution, where basically the Irish working class was able to rebel against basically these forms of against Britain, and was able to actually coincide against their struggle against Britain. That was specifically made up by the working class, and specifically made to resist against the British imperialist actions against industry within the Irish people. It's basically forcing Ireland to be dependent toward Britain because majority of their industry was being financed by British banks, and the capital was basically being financed by Britain, and which committed imperialism within Ireland by the British state. This was again something that was made up by the workers themselves, and was even an attack against capitalism itself, with even other forms of basically socialist resistances and specific socialist resistances against Britain that happened during the time period of the Irish Revolution, such as the Limerick Soviet and Cork Soviet, Dublin Soviet, and many other Soviets that were established within Ireland at the time. However, these Soviets would then later be defunct, or would later be crushed by Britain or by the pro-treaty Irish Republican Army because of basically the spontaneity and the ineffectiveness of spontaneity as well, where there was a lack of motivation for the working class to even resist in the first place, or to keep on the resistance against Britain and against counter-revolutionaries within the Irish Revolution. As well as the fact also not necessarily understanding the kind of formats that basically goes on basically around this point, and that basically led them to not have enough planning to basically fight against Britain and Ireland entirely to be able to sustain themselves against those people, which again coincides with basically the need for a vanguard party. I bring these movements up, and I'm going to bring up other movements, such as the National Liberation Movement of Scotland against Britain as well, on how that coincides with basically the resistance against racism as well, because these formats of basically resistance against racism and the calls for national liberation is a specific thing that essentially coincides with the internationalism of these national liberation movements, and how these even come about in the first place, and why it is necessary for us communists to even support them in the first place as well. Which goes to my next point and the next chapter of basically this series, the internationalism and national liberation. So what do we have so far? Well, capitalism itself just seeks to dominate over other nations and grow the proletariat as large as it can. However, by doing this, it doesn't entail that the nation doing this is another nation, rather a class of people doing it to another class of people that spans the people and the general regardless of national affiliation. This goes for classes that are employed, thus there isn't even an oppressed national people, mostly under an oppressed international people from another international people with different social relations to the means of production. In other words, this is more of a format of class struggle than really rate. In other words, this is more of a conflict based off class struggle rather than conflict based off national identity. Therefore, international action has always changed the world, and itself is how the world operates and always has. Communists thus must be internationalists. So then how do we put that internationalism into action? Well, the national borders and the nations still exist under the rule of the capitalists and national people, thereby lose of their importance of nationality and becomes proletarians, like the rest of the proletariat. Thus means that the proletariat spans across the world, and thus means that the oppressed is all over the world and affects everyone. Thus, when workers then organize in a national liberation movement to fight against the oppression and domination of a capitalist state through its imperialism and calls for a national liberation of a given area, that actually speaks to the overall class struggle for these people that were integrated into the proletariat to serve these interests of the bourgeoisie against theirs. And the same thing is happening to others of the other oppressor's nation. And the same thing it could happen of the other oppressor's nation under the solidarity slogan that the proletariat and the imperialist nation also have the common enemy of the proletariat and the imperialized nation that is calling for national liberation to fight against that bourgeois class and to fight against that bourgeoisie in the first place. Thus they get fed up and they revolt, and it speaks to other workers, and when they revolt as well, at the same movement to stand in solidarity with other workers against the domination of the bourgeoisie they know from experiencing it themselves at home. In other words, national liberation movements actually provides an international solidarity of the working class entirely internationally, regardless of basically national affiliation, and regardless on the fact of whether or not they're calling for national liberation of a specific nationality or of a specific area made up of that nationality. Doesn't matter, because if they're working class and if they are essentially made up of the working class, that does speak to the international class struggle that makes up the majority of the entire world. And this is something that Marx was essentially talking about, and it's even something that the reason why he supported the American Civil War in the first place, because the black people's struggle and the enslaved struggles against slavery and the formats of slavery that put them into work through labor time corresponds to the same struggle that the working class of England and the rest of Europe were facing against their own capitalist bosses that were also forcing them to basically work huge amounts of labor time to produce commodities without much profit and without much compensation for their work, just as the enslaved in America. Quote, "This is in fact a masterly piece of logic. Anti-slavery England cannot sympathize with the North breaking down the withering influence of slaveocracy. Because she cannot forget that the North, while bound to its influence, supported the slave trade and mobbed the abolitionists and had its democratic institutions tainted by the slave drivers' prejudices. She cannot sympathize with Mr. Lincoln's administration because she had to find fault in Mr. Buchanan's administration. She must needs certainly cavil on the present movement of the Northern resurrection. Cheer up the Northern sympathizers with the slave trade branded in the Republican platform, and coquette with the slaveocracy, setting up an empire of its own. Because she cannot forget that the North of yesterday was not the North of today. The necessity of justifying its attitude by such pettifogging of the Old Bailey pleas proves that more than anything else of the anti-northern part of the English press is instigated by the hidden motives too mean and drastically to be openly avowed." End quote. Karl Marx, The American Question in England. This same thing happened even in Marx's time as well during the Cockcrow Revolution of 1848, which is something I brought up in the prefaces and the introduction in part 1 of this video series, when talking about basically national liberation and the international solidarity that these movements actually play into the overall class struggle that basically happens around this time, and the reason why we should support these national liberation movements, and why we especially in the question of basically black nationalism and black national liberation as well. Quote, "First of all, of course, sympathy is subjected to the people in which the inconsistent heroic struggle against its oppressors has been proven as a historical right to national autonomy and self-determination. It is not in the least contradiction put to the International Workers' Party's strives to the creation of the Polish nation. On the contrary, only after Poland has won independence again, only after it is be able to govern itself again as a free people, only can the interdevelopment begin again and to cooperate as an independent force of the social transformation of Europe. As long as the independent life of a nation is suppressed by a foreign conqueror, it inevitably directs all its strength, all its efforts, and all its energy against the external enemy during this time. Therefore, in its inner life, remains paralyzed and the incapable of working for social emancipation. Ireland and Russia under Mongol rule provide striking proof of this. Emancipation, Ireland and Russia under Mongol rule provide striking proof of this. Another reason of sympathy felt by the Workers' Party for the Polish uprising and its particular geographic, military, and historical position. The partition of Poland is a cement which holds together the three great military despots, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Only the rebirth of Poland can tear these bonds apart and thereby remove the greatest obstacle in the way of the social emancipation of the European peoples. End quote. Karl Marx for Poland. Frederick Engels also had this exact same sympathy onto the reason why he supported the Cackle Revolution as well. Quote, a nation cannot become free at the same time continue to oppress other nations. The liberation of Germany cannot therefore take place without the liberation of Poland from German oppression. And because of this, Poland and Germany have a common interest. And because of this, Polish and German Democrats can work together for the liberation of both nations. I also believe that the first decisive blow will lead to the victory of democracy, to the liberation of all European nations, will be struck by the English Chartists. I have lived in England for a number of years, and now openly align myself with the Chartist movement during this period. The English Chartists will be the first to rise because it is precisely in England that the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is the most intense. And why is it the most intense? Because in England, as a result of modern industry and the introduction of machinery, all oppressed classes have been merged together into a single great class with common interests, the class of the proletariat. Because as a consequence, on the opposite side, all classes of oppressors have likewise been united into a single class, the bourgeoisie. The struggle and thus has been simplified, and so it will be possible to decide it by one single heavy blow. Isn't this so? The aristocracy no longer has any power in England. The bourgeoisie alone rules and has taken into the aristocracy entail. But the whole great mass of people opposed to the bourgeoisie, united in a formidable phalanx, whose victory over the ruling capitalists draws nearer and nearer, and you have to think machinery for its elimination of the opposed interests, which previously divided the different sections of workers for this leveling of the living standards of all workers. End quote. Frederick Engels on Poland. At the end of the day, the reason why to support national liberation movements can be summed up in this one quote alone, and why it is necessary for us to support it in the first place. But what did the communism of the Cackle Revolution consist of? Was it communist because it wanted to restore the Polish nationality? One could as well say that the war with the European coalition waged against Napoleon was communistic, and the Congress of Vienna in 1815 was made up of the crowned communists. Or was the Cackle Revolution communistic because it wanted to install a democratic government? Nobody would accuse the millions of citizens of Bern and New York of communistic impulses. Communism denies the necessity of the existence of classes. It wants to abolish all classes and all class distinctions. The Cackle Revolution wanted to expropriate only the political distinctions among classes. It wanted to give equal rights to all classes. End quote. Karl Marx. Communism, Revolution, and a Free Poland. This same reason of supporting the Polish national liberation movement that Marx had also corresponded to the same reasons why many Leninists and many Bolshevik members ended up supporting the Irish Revolution, despite the fact it wasn't predominantly communist or even majorly communist as well. So it's the same reason why Marx and Engels still supported the revolution of 1848 and even the Polish national liberation movement, despite the fact it wasn't predominantly communist or even progressive. Rather on the fact that basically it still coincided and was still made up by workers themselves that were still acting in against capitalism regardless of the fact of their tendency. And for us to be able to spread class and political consciousness to these spontaneous movements of national liberation that come up, and for us to basically spread that consciousness can coincide with the international solidarity even further, to the point where basically there could be the total abolition of capitalism entirely. You cannot have a free America against capitalism. You cannot have a free America unless black people in the United States of America as well are also free from the factors and from the oppression of white supremacy, which coincides with the total call and with the total slogan, not for just the class war, but for the war against capitalism as a whole. In order to have a free America, you need to have a free New Africa. And that free New Africa is to be among the American South itself, where black people make up the majority of the population within the United States. Without a free America, You cannot have a free America without a free New Africa. That's the thing that basically Bad Mouse and Professor Flowers are trying to get at people like Ian Vaush or Demon Mama, and it's the same thing that at least what I'm going to try to get at to left communists among the internationalist communist tendency, and Donnie Glungsting as a council communist and among the international socialist tendency. You cannot have a free Israeli state. The Israeli state itself is literally defined as a state that oppresses against the Palestinians. The only way you can have the Palestinian people be free is if the Palestinian National Liberation Movement itself is the free state. You cannot have a free working class within Palestine unless Palestine as a nation is free. You cannot have a free Britain unless Scotland itself is also free from British oppression and from British militarism. Only then can these international class struggles, and only then can basically these forms of class struggles can coincide itself with the total liberation of classes, which is why we need to support these national liberation movements, which is why we need to support the establishment of a new African Republic, and which is why we need to call for only a one-state solution within Palestine, and that one-state solution is Palestine itself. And of course, it does not mean that we are for states in general, but we are for the national autonomy of Palestinians and their own nation, which is indeed their own nation, for they occupied it, and they've been occupying it for thousands of years after the first Israeli kingdoms have left the area in the first place. It's the same reason why we support the national autonomy of Scotland, because this national autonomy and this national liberation is something that coincides with the international class struggle that the English working class also faces in solidarity and in comradeship with the Scottish working class against the same oppressors, that being the British and English bourgeoisie. Just like you could not have a free Germany without a free Poland, or a free Russia without a free Poland, or a free Russia without a free Estonia, Latvia, you cannot have a free England without a free Scotland. Because they are concentrated into one class, that being the proletariat, and that proletariat class spans internationally around the globe. And because of that, these resistances against basically these forms of imperialist action also corresponds to the international class struggle and the international solidarity among workers to be able to like face against this form of oppression, which is something that we need to be able to understand, and it actually shows the importance of national liberation movements entirely.
Why does it look like it might be the year of the ballot or the bullet? Because Negroes have listened to the trickery and the lies and the false promises of the white man now for too long, and they're fed up. They've become disenchanted. They've become disillusioned. They've become dissatisfied. And all of this has built up frustrations in the black community that makes the black community throughout America today more explosive than all of the atomic bombs the Russians can ever invent. Whenever you got a racial powder keg sitting in your lap, you're in more trouble than if you had an atomic powder keg sitting in your lap. When a racial powder keg goes off, it doesn't care who it knocks out the way. Understand this, it's dangerous. Because what can the white man use now to fool us? After he put down that march on Washington, and you see all through that now, he tricked you, had you marching down to Washington. Yes, as you marching back and forth between the feet of a dead man named Lincoln and another dead man named George Washington, singing "We Shall Overcome." He made a chump out of you. He made a fool out of you. He made you think you were going somewhere, and you end up going nowhere but between Lincoln and Washington. So today our people are disillusioned. They've become disenchanted. They've become dissatisfied. And in their frustrations, they want action. You'll see this young black man, this new generation, asking for the ballot or the bullet. That old
That segment was from a speech by Malcolm X called "Black Nationalism Can Set Us Free." I think everything that he basically just stated there kind of represents the kind of struggles that basically does coincide with these national liberation movements and the reason why we should even support them in the first place. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, the subscribe button. This is the end of the series, finally. We got it finished. Oh my god. Anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. If you're new to my channel, the subscribe button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, yeah, hit the subscribe button. I'd also very much appreciate that. And if you want to help out into basically building up national liberation movements and actually, you know, working towards national liberation, I would recommend basically joining into organizations. With me, I am a part of the International Socialist tendency, and I would recommend others, if you follow my ideas and you follow basically some of the things that I basically talk about or agree with them majority of the time, if not a lot of the time, then I would recommend you basically join the International Socialist tendency if you are up for basically actual activism. If not, that's also fine. You can do your own part on basically being able to write and also do your own media as well, or just read theory. Reading theory is indeed important, and I would not discourage anyone to just read theory entirely. In fact, reading theory is very much important. We do need people that can put enough time and effort to basically read into other things. And if you want to do that, that's also fine. Yeah, thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed. See ya.